My name is Grace. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worked inside rooms where decisions are made quietly. Conference rooms with glass walls, budgets projected in pale blue light, voices lowered not out of secrecy, but habit. People tend to describe me the same way, if they notice me at all. Reliable, calm, easy to work with. I've learned that those words can be a compliment, or a way of saying you're not seen as a threat. I don't raise my voice. I don't posture. I don't announce my ambition before it's ready to stand on its own. And because of that, I've often been underestimated in ways that are almost polite. This isn't a story about revenge. There's no shouting, no dramatic walkouts, no viral confrontation caught on a phone camera. What happened unfolded slowly, the way real power shifts usually do, through documentation, patience, and the discipline to wait until facts speak louder than feelings. I'm telling this story because it took me years to understand something simple. Silence isn't the same as weakness, and integrity doesn't mean accepting erosion. For a long time, I believed that if I just kept my head down and did my job well, fairness would eventually assert itself. That belief was comfortable. It was also incomplete. This story traces an emotional journey more than a professional one. It begins with being invisible in plain sight, valued for output, dismissed in presence. It moves through moments so small they barely registered at the time, but left marks I couldn't quite explain. And it ends with a reckoning that wasn't loud or cruel, but definitive. My boss was escorted out, and I was promoted the same week. What you don't know, what I didn't fully understand until much later, is how little of that outcome had to do with me winning, and how much it had to do with truth finally having a clear path forward. When a fake financial report surfaced, it wasn't a weapon I forged. It was evidence that already existed, waiting for someone disciplined enough to see it clearly, and restrained enough not to misuse it. What mattered wasn't exposure for exposure's sake. It was what happens when accountability meets documentation. I'm sharing this honestly, without embellishment, because many people listening will recognize the early chapters of this story in their own lives. The overlooked contribution, the normalized dismissal, the quiet calculation of whether speaking up is worth the cost. So before we begin, before I take you back to who I was to them, and how that version of me slowly changed, let me ask you something gently and without judgment. Have you ever realized that people only see you as deeply as you allow the structure around you to reveal you? To them, I was dependable background noise. That's the most accurate way I can describe it. Not invisible exactly, but constant enough to fade into the environment, like the hum of an air conditioner in a meeting room. You only notice it when it stops. In the office, people associated me with outcomes, not presence. If a report was accurate, on time, and clean, they assumed it came from the system, not from me. If a projection aligned perfectly with the quarter's actuals, it was considered expected. My name rarely followed the work out loud. When it did, it was usually paired with phrases like, "Grace will handle it," or "She's good with details." Details. That word followed me everywhere. It sounded flattering at first, but over time, I realized it functioned as a ceiling. Details were where I was allowed to live. Strategy happened elsewhere. Authority lived at the head of the table, where voices overlapped and confidence was mistaken for clarity. My boss, Ethan, rarely looked at me when he spoke. Not because he was overtly rude, he just didn't need to. In his mental map of the team, I was a fixed utility, reliable, non-threatening, already categorized. In meetings, I'd sit slightly off-center, laptop open, pen aligned parallel to the notebook's spine. Old habits. I listened more than I spoke, not because I lacked opinions, but because I'd learned early that speaking didn't always increase influence. Sometimes it did the opposite. When I did speak, it was usually to confirm numbers, flag minor risks, or answer direct questions. My tone stayed neutral, calm. I watched how people reacted to emotion, how frustration could derail credibility, how enthusiasm could be dismissed as naivete. So I stayed level. That steadiness became my brand. They trusted me. That's important. They trusted me deeply. They just didn't see me. I wasn't invited into impromptu conversations after meetings, the ones where real decisions began forming. I wasn't CC'd on emails where tone mattered more than content. I learned about shifts in direction the same way a compass does, by sensing pressure changes, not by being told. And still I stayed, not out of fear, out of calculation. I told myself a story. This is how professionals earn respect. They don't push, they don't demand visibility, they let consistency speak. I believed that story because it was tidy. It allowed me to interpret dismissal as patience and invisibility as humility. There was no single insult I could point to, no dramatic slight, just a slow accumulation of moments where my contributions were absorbed without acknowledgement, where my questions were answered but never expanded upon, where my silence was mistaken for agreement. What I didn't understand then was that roles, once assigned, harden quickly. To them, I was the person who would clean up loose ends, the one who caught errors before audits, the one who stayed late without making it a performance. I was the person you relied on, but never worried about replacing at the table. And I reinforced that image without realizing it. I dressed conservatively. I didn't interrupt. I deferred when conversations became heated. I chose precision over persuasion. All admirable traits, all safe traits. Looking back, I can see how comfortable they were with me being exactly where I was. Comfort breeds blindness, and blindness, unchecked, becomes entitlement. But at the time, I didn't feel wronged. I felt correctly placed. That's the part that's hardest to admit. I wasn't suffering. I was functioning. I was succeeding by every visible metric. And because there was no obvious harm, there was no urgency to question the structure I was operating inside. I didn't yet understand that being underestimated isn't neutral. It's directional. It points somewhere. And eventually, it points toward a moment when someone assumes you won't notice something you absolutely will. The first time it happened, I almost missed it. That's what makes moments like this dangerous. They arrive without ceremony. No raised voices, no awkward silence afterward. Just a sentence that lands slightly off-center, then keeps moving as if nothing important occurred. We were in a mid-quarter review meeting, 12 people around the table. Coffee is going cold. Slides are moving too fast. I had prepared the financial risk summary, 3 weeks of cross-checking vendor data, reconciling forecasts that didn't quite agree with each other. I'd flagged a discrepancy that wasn't alarming yet, but it was real. When my slide came up, Ethan summarized it before I could speak. He didn't say anything technically incorrect that's important. He simply reframed it. He called the discrepancy timing noise, a phrase that sounds sophisticated enough to end the discussion. Then he moved on. I remember opening my mouth just slightly to add context, not to contradict him, just to clarify. But the conversation had already advanced. Someone asked about revenue growth. Another joked about the coffee. The moment closed. No one looked at me. I told myself it didn't matter. The numbers were still in the deck. The information existed. That's what counted. Except something in my chest tightened, just enough to notice. After the meeting, 2 colleagues thanked Ethan for catching that early. One of them nodded at me in passing, like you do when you walk past someone in a hallway you recognize but don't need. That was the cut. Small, clean, almost surgical. I replayed it that evening while washing a mug I didn't remember using. I asked myself if I was being sensitive, if I were reading into things. I'd always prided myself on being rational, not reactive. This felt too small to justify discomfort. So I did what I always did. I documented, not in a dramatic way. I wrote one sentence in my notebook. Q2 review. Risk framing changed verbally. No emotion, just a note. The next few weeks were normal, or what passed for normal. Work flowed, deadlines met. Ethan continued to rely on me heavily. If anything, my workload increased, which I took as validation. But I noticed something else. In subsequent meetings, Ethan started preemptively summarizing my sections more often. Always accurately. Always confidently. He never claimed the work as his own outright. He simply became the voice through which it traveled. When I spoke, he nodded. When I paused, he filled the silence. No one objected. Why would they? It was efficient, seamless. It saved time. Efficiency is an excellent disguise. I tried once, carefully, to reassert my voice. I added a short verbal clarification during a meeting, keeping my tone neutral. Ethan smiled and said, "Yes, that's what I meant." Then he continued. I didn't push. That night, I stared at my notebook longer than usual. I didn't write anything new. I just looked at the accumulation of small factual observations. None of them was actionable alone. Together, they formed a pattern I wasn't ready to name. What unsettled me wasn't the behavior itself. It was how quickly everyone accepted the new rhythm. No one thought it was strange that my voice had faded. No one wondered whether the person doing the work should also be the one contextualizing it. The system adjusted without friction. That's when I realized something quietly unsettling. Respect isn't only about competence, it's about association. And once your work becomes associated with someone else's authority, disentangling it is difficult. I didn't confront Ethan, I didn't complain, I didn't even mention it to friends. I wasn't hurt, I was alert. And there's a difference. That small cut didn't bleed, it didn't scar, but it changed the way I moved, the way I listened, the way I started paying attention was not just to what was said, but to who was allowed to say it. I didn't know yet where that awareness would lead. I only knew I wouldn't forget it. Once something happens twice, your mind starts building a framework around it. The second and third times didn't feel like incidents anymore. They felt like data points, quiet repetitions that slipped neatly into the background rhythm of work. Easy to excuse if you weren't looking directly at them. I stayed very good at not looking directly. Ethan continued to rely on me in the same way someone relies on infrastructure. He forwarded complex spreadsheets with brief messages. Can you sanity check this? Or need eyes on this before EOD? No greetings, no context, just expectation. I delivered every time. During meetings, my role settled into something unspoken. I was the verifier, the confirmer, the one who nodded when numbers were correct and gently corrected when they weren't. Usually in side conversations after decisions had already been framed. When I raised concerns, I did it softly, carefully. I learned which words triggered defensiveness and which ones slid through unnoticed. Just something to keep an eye on. Probably nothing, but I diluted my own clarity to preserve harmony, and everyone rewarded me for it. "You're so level-headed," someone said once, smiling as if that were the highest form of praise. Another colleague joked that I was the adult in the room. I laughed because laughing was easier than interrogating why adulthood seemed to exclude authority. What I didn't admit to myself was how much I was helping normalize my own dismissal. Every time Ethan reframed my findings without attribution, and I stayed silent, the behavior became easier to repeat. Every time a meeting ended without my perspective being formally acknowledged, the absence felt less noticeable. Disrespect, I learned, doesn't always arrive as cruelty. Sometimes it arrives as a convenience. There were moments, brief, inconvenient ones, when I considered speaking up more forcefully. I'd rehearse sentences in my head on the walk to work. Neutral sentences, professional ones, sentences that wouldn't sound emotional or defensive. But when the moment came, I'd hesitate. I told myself I was being strategic, that choosing my battles was wise, that visibility gained through conflict wasn't worth the cost. I believed that maintaining access mattered more than asserting credit. And to be fair, that belief wasn't baseless. I had seen what happened to people who pushed too hard, too soon. They were labeled difficult, not a team player. The organization had a way of protecting its own equilibrium. So I adapted. I spoke less in group settings and more in private. I refined my emails until they were bulletproof. I made sure every number could withstand scrutiny, every assumption traced back to a source. If my voice was going to be filtered through someone else, at least the substance would remain intact. What I didn't realize was that by doing this, I was becoming indispensable in the most limiting way possible. Indispensable people are rarely promoted. They're preserved. The more reliable I became, the less anyone questioned whether I should be more. My silence was interpreted as consent. My restraint was mistaken for contentment. And slowly, so slowly I didn't mark the moment, I stopped expecting recognition. That's the most dangerous normalization of all. You adjust your expectations downward, not because you think you deserve less, but because hoping for more feels inefficient, disruptive, naive. I remember one afternoon, sitting in a meeting where a strategic decision was made based on projections I had built. The room buzzed with confidence. People congratulated each other. I sat there, hands folded, feeling oddly detached. Not angry, not resentful, just absent. It occurred to me then that I could leave the room, and the conversation would continue without interruption. The work would still be referenced, the decisions would still be made. I would exist as a function, not a presence. That realization didn't hurt. It clarified. I started to understand that I wasn't being pushed down. I was being kept in place. And the structure only worked because I helped maintain it. Still, I didn't act. Not yet. Normalization has a numbing effect. It convinces you that what you're experiencing is simply how things are, that questioning it would be an overreaction, that endurance is professionalism. But beneath that logic, something was shifting. I began paying attention not to how I felt, but to how patterns formed, to what repeated itself without resistance, to what people assumed would always be available, always compliant, always quiet. I didn't feel wronged. I felt positioned. And once you realize you're being positioned, the question stops being, why is this happening? And becomes, what does this position allow me to see? Roles are rarely announced. They emerge. No one ever sat me down and explained what was expected of me beyond my job description. But expectations have a way of clarifying themselves through repetition, through what's rewarded, through what's ignored. By the time I recognized the role I'd been assigned, I'd already been playing it flawlessly. I was the stabilizer, the one you loop in when something needs to be fixed quietly, the person who absorbs complexity and returns simplicity. I made chaos legible. I smoothed edges. I closed gaps before they became visible to leadership. And because I did it without complaint, the system learned something dangerous. I could be leaned on without consequence. Ethan trusted me more than anyone else on the team. The trust, however, had a very specific shape. He trusted me with execution, not influence, with analysis, not interpretation, with responsibility, not authority. I saw how differently he treated others. When colleagues pushed back in meetings, he debated them. When they made mistakes, he corrected them publicly. When they presented ideas with confidence, even half-formed ones, he entertained them. With me, he assumed alignment. If I disagreed, I would say so carefully, privately, after the fact. And because I never forced a moment of friction, he never prepared for one. That was my role: reliable, useful, invisible. I could feel it most clearly in moments of crisis. When a vendor issue threatened to delay a report, Ethan called me first. Not to ask what I thought should be done, but to ask me to make it work. When leadership questioned a variance, I was asked to double-check the math, not to explain the implications. I became the person who made other people look competent. And again, I need to be honest, I let it happen. There was safety in that role, predictability. I knew exactly what was expected of me, and I met those expectations with precision. There's a quiet satisfaction in being the person everyone relies on, even if they don't fully acknowledge it. But there's a cost. When you're assigned a role early, people stop updating their perception of you. Growth becomes invisible. Change goes unnoticed. Your capabilities are capped not by your skill, but by someone else's initial assessment. I started noticing how often decisions were framed before I entered the room, how assumptions about risk, feasibility, and timeline were made without my input, despite my proximity to the data. Once in a meeting, a senior leader asked a question directly related to a model I had built. Ethan answered confidently and incorrectly, not dramatically, just subtly off. I corrected it gently. He paused, adjusted his response, and moved on. No acknowledgement, no recalibration of who should be answering those questions. The room followed his lead. That's when it fully crystallized for me. My role wasn't just about what I did, it was about what others expected me not to do. I wasn't expected to challenge narratives. I wasn't expected to reframe conversations. I wasn't expected to lead. And because expectations shape behavior, people weren't listening to those things for me anymore. I didn't resent Ethan for this. That surprised me. He wasn't malicious. He wasn't threatened. He was operating efficiently within a structure that rewarded confidence over accuracy, presentation over preparation. I fit neatly into the machinery. The problem wasn't him. The problem was that the role I was playing required me to stay small. And staying small, over time, requires a kind of self-erasure that's easy to justify but hard to reverse. I started asking myself questions I'd avoided before. What would happen if I stopped cushioning mistakes? If I let uncertainty remain visible? If I spoke in rooms where my voice hadn't been invited yet? Those questions didn't come with immediate answers, but they marked the beginning of a shift, from endurance to awareness, from acceptance to evaluation. I hadn't decided to change anything yet, but I had stopped assuming the role I was given was the only one available. The shift didn't happen during a confrontation. There was no argument, no raised voice, No moment where someone finally crossed a line so obvious it demanded a response. If anything, the day itself was unremarkable. Overcast, slow, forgettable, which is why it stayed with me. It was a Thursday. I remember because Thursdays were when Ethan liked to finalize weekly numbers before sending summaries up the chain. I had been asked, again, to review a consolidated financial report. Nothing unusual, except this time, something didn't reconcile. At first, I assumed it was my mistake. That was my default setting. I retraced formulas, rechecked source files, and confirmed timestamps. Everything on my end was clean. The discrepancy was small but persistent. Not a rounding error, not timing noise. A classification issue. I flagged it in the margin of the document, just as I always did, and sent it back with a neutral note. One item worth revisiting, possible misclassification in vendor accruals. Minutes later, Ethan walked over to my desk. He didn't look concerned. If anything, he looked mildly inconvenienced. "I saw your note," he said. "It's fine. We've already aligned on this." Aligned. The word landed heavier than it should have. I asked one clarifying question. Just one. About the long-term impact if the classification remained unchanged. I kept my tone steady, professional, curious. Ethan exhaled, barely noticeable, and said, "Grace, this is why I need you on details. Let's not overcomplicate it." Then he smiled, a soft close to the conversation. He walked away. I sat there for a long time after that, longer than necessary. The report is still open on my screen. The numbers are unchanged. What shifted wasn't anger, it was permission. Up until that moment, some part of me still believed that if I presented things clearly enough, carefully enough, they would be addressed. That truth, once visible, would naturally guide action. That belief dissolved quietly. I realized that the issue wasn't that Ethan didn't understand the discrepancy. It was that understanding that it wasn't useful to him in that moment. Acknowledging it would slow things down, raise questions, complicate narratives already in motion. And I understood something else too. He wasn't asking me to be wrong. He was asking me to be quiet, not overtly, not maliciously, just conveniently. That's when I felt the internal shift. I stopped trying to resolve the issue immediately. I didn't push back. I didn't escalate. I didn't argue. I saved a copy of the report. I saved the original data. I saved my notes. And for the first time, I didn't do it as a matter of habit. I did it as a choice. I went home that evening and didn't open my laptop again. I didn't replay the conversation obsessively. I didn't vent to anyone. I let the realization settle. I saw the structure clearly now. My role was to catch problems early, so they could be neutralized, reframed, or ignored before anyone else saw them. I was a buffer, a filter. And filters don't decide what flows through. They're designed to stop things quietly. That understanding didn't make me angry. It made me calm. Calm in a way that's different from acceptance. This calm had edges. It had direction. I didn't decide to confront Ethan. I didn't decide to expose anything. I didn't decide to leave. I decided something smaller and more consequential. I decided to stop cushioning outcomes. If something was misclassified, I would document it fully. If a risk existed, I would trace it to its implications. If my voice wasn't welcome in the room, my work would still speak. Unaltered, unsoftened. Silence, I realized, didn't have to mean compliance. It could mean preparation. That Thursday didn't look like a turning point from the outside. No one noticed anything different about me the next day. I answered emails the same way. I attended meetings. I smiled when appropriate. But internally, the contract had changed. I was no longer assuming good faith would correct structural issues on its own. I was watching, recording, choosing. And once you make that shift, from hoping the system will self-correct to understanding how it actually moves, you stop reacting. You start positioning. After that Thursday, nothing about my behavior changed on the surface. That was intentional. I still arrived early. I still met deadlines. I still answered questions with the same even tone. If anyone had been watching closely, which they weren't, they might have noticed that I spoke slightly less in meetings, but even that could be explained away as focus or fatigue. What changed was not my silence. It was my relationship to it. Before, silence had been my default, a byproduct of caution, professionalism, and a belief that clarity would eventually rise on its own. Now, silence was deliberate, measured, chosen. I stopped filling gaps. When Ethan paused mid-sentence, expecting me to supply context or confirm assumptions, I didn't rush in. I waited. Not pointedly, not challengingly, just long enough for the pause to become visible. Sometimes he corrected himself, sometimes someone else jumped in, sometimes the moment passed without resolution. I let it. I noticed how uncomfortable unfilled silence made certain people, how quickly they moved to smooth it over, how rarely anyone asked the one person who actually had the data. That was information. I also stopped translating complexity unless asked. Before, if I sensed confusion in the room, I'd instinctively reframe things, simplify language, draw connections, make it easier for decisions to be made quickly. Now, I presented my work as it was, precise, sourced, and complete. If someone wanted it distilled, they could ask. Most didn't. I wasn't being passive-aggressive, I wasn't withholding. I was honoring the boundary between contribution and control. And that boundary revealed things. Errors that I would have previously corrected quietly began surfacing elsewhere. Not catastrophic ones, yet, but inconsistencies that made conversations slightly less smooth, slightly more effortful. No one traced them back to me. Why would they? I was still doing my job. I began keeping a more detailed record, not just of numbers, but of decisions. Who approved what? Which assumptions were verbal? Which concerns were acknowledged? And which were dismissed? Again, nothing dramatic, just timelines, versions, context. Documentation is a form of memory that doesn't argue back. What surprised me was how invisible this shift was. People often assume that choosing silence means retreat. Not asserting yourself is the same as stepping away. But most systems are built on predictability. When you change how you participate without announcing it, the system doesn't register the change right away. It just keeps moving. And in that movement, blind spots open. Ethan grew more confident, more relaxed. He assumed alignment because there had always been alignment. He spoke for the team without checking. He summarized outcomes without caveats. And because I didn't interrupt, his confidence went unchallenged. I watched how often my name appeared in private messages asking for fixes, after decisions had already been made. How often urgency replaced curiosity. The workload didn't increase. The stakes did. I felt no urgency to intervene. That's the part that might sound cold, but it wasn't. It was grounded. I wasn't hoping for failure. I wasn't engineering it. I was allowing reality to remain intact. Silence, when chosen, creates space, and space reveals pressure points. I also noticed how my own emotional response changed. I wasn't bracing myself before meetings anymore. I wasn't rehearsing how to phrase concerns delicately. I wasn't carrying responsibility that wasn't formally mine. That lightness was new. It came from understanding that being heard is not the same as being responsible for outcomes. If my role was to provide accurate information, and I was doing that, then what others chose to do with it was on them. That realization is stabilizing. I wasn't waiting for an opportunity to speak up. I was waiting to see what happened when I didn't. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, patterns began to strain. Assumptions layered on top of assumptions. Small shortcuts compounded. The kind of things that don't matter until they do. No alarms went off, no red flags waved. But the system was no longer being quietly corrected behind the scenes. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what that might reveal. Because I wasn't planning to expose anyone. I was planning to let the truth stand long enough to become undeniable. What they never noticed wasn't a single act. It was the accumulation. While meetings continued and deadlines cycled through their familiar rhythm, I was building something quietly in parallel. Not a plan, not a trap, but a record. A clear chronological map of how decisions were made, how data moved, and where interpretation began to diverge from reality. I didn't start this with an endgame in mind. That's important. I wasn't plotting someone's downfall. I was responding to a shift in understanding. If accountability ever became necessary, it would require clarity, not emotion. So I focused on clarity. I organized my work differently. Each report had a version history, not just timestamps, but rationale. Why did a number change? Who requested the change? Whether it was based on new information or a reframing of existing data. I saved emails, but more importantly, I saved context. I made notes about verbal instructions that weren't documented elsewhere. Phrases like, "let's handle this later," or "we don't need to get into that now," became markers, not judgments. I cross-referenced vendor reports with internal summaries. Not because I expected fraud, but because misalignment often hides in translation. Between what's recorded and what's reported, I began to see patterns. Certain adjustments always flowed in one direction. Certain discrepancies were consistently labeled as temporary, even when they persisted across quarters. Certain explanations appeared only verbally, never in writing. None of this was explosive. None of it would have raised concern on its own. But together it formed a narrative that was incomplete. And incompleteness is dangerous in financial systems. What made this possible was access. Because I was trusted, deeply trusted, I was included in everything that mattered operationally. I saw raw data before it was shaped. I knew which questions leadership asked and which ones they didn't. And because I wasn't perceived as ambitious or confrontational, no one filtered what they said around me. People spoke freely, assumed alignment, assumed discretion. They were right about the discretion. They were wrong about the alignment. I never corrected anyone. I never challenged a framing in the moment. I never said this could be a problem. I simply made sure that if the question was ever asked by the right person at the right time, the answer would already exist. Prepared, sourced, calm. There's a discipline to this kind of work. You have to resist the urge to editorialize, to add commentary, to connect dots prematurely. The moment you start telling a story instead of preserving facts, you introduce vulnerability. So I didn't tell a story. I built an archive. What surprised me most was how little attention this required emotionally. Once I stopped hoping for recognition or fairness, the work became almost meditative. There was no tension in my body when I noticed something off. Just focus. I wasn't carrying resentment. I wasn't waiting for validation. I was waiting for alignment between reality and oversight. And that alignment always comes eventually. What they also never noticed was how my questions changed. I asked fewer of them. And when I did ask, they were specific, narrow, unthreatening. Just confirming. For my notes, make sure I'm tracking. Each answer filled in another blank. Ethan, in particular, grew more comfortable. He delegated more, oversaw less. He trusted that I would flag anything truly important, and I would have if he'd wanted to hear it. But what he wanted was continuity, smoothness, reports that told a story leadership already expected. And so that's what he got, until the story and the data diverged too far to reconcile quietly. I remember the moment I realized the archive had become something else. I was reviewing a quarterly reconciliation and noticed a classification pattern repeating for the third time. Same vendor type, same explanation, same deferral language. It wasn't egregious, but it was no longer ambiguous. I leaned back in my chair and felt nothing. No excitement, no fear, just clarity. The material existed now, not as an accusation, but as evidence, not as intent, but as fact. I closed my notebook and didn't write anything new that day. Because preparation, I realized, isn't about doing more. It's about knowing when you've done enough. The reveal didn't arrive as a shock. It arrived as confirmation. By the time I sat down to review the full arc of what I'd collected, I already knew what I was going to find. Still, there's something sobering about seeing it all laid out in sequence. Dates, versions, approvals, rationales. Each one reasonable on its own, unmistakable together. I didn't rush this moment. I waited until a Friday afternoon when the office had thinned out, when no one would notice me staying late. I closed my email, silenced notifications, opened only what I needed. The first thing I did was remove the interpretation. I didn't ask why anything happened. I didn't speculate about motive. I focused only on what had happened and how consistently it had happened. That discipline mattered, because what emerged wasn't corruption in the cinematic sense. No secret accounts, no dramatic theft. What emerged was something more common and more dangerous. A pattern of misrepresentation. Certain financial classifications had been adjusted after initial review, always in ways that improved short-term appearance, always justified verbally, rarely documented with the same rigor as the original data. It wasn't fraud by intention. It was fraud by convenience. Pressure from above, expectations from leadership, a desire to present stability where there was volatility, all understandable impulses, all unacceptable outcomes. And here's the part that grounded me. Ethan wasn't acting alone, but he was the final filter. Every adjustment passed through him. Every reframing was his call. Every decision to leave something undocumented rested on his authority. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt responsible. Because now that I saw it clearly, I understood something else. This wasn't just about him. It was about the company's exposure. The longer this continued, the more fragile the structure became. And I was standing at the intersection of trust and truth. That's not a dramatic place to stand. It's a lonely one. I closed my laptop and sat there, hands folded, staring at the dark reflection of the screen. I didn't feel adrenaline. I didn't feel fear. I felt weight. I thought about all the moments I could have intervened earlier, all the times I'd softened language, deferred conversations, chosen silence for the sake of harmony. None of that had caused this, but none of it had prevented it either. Still, I didn't blame myself. Responsibility does not mean self-punishment. It means choosing carefully once clarity arrives. I asked myself a simple question. What is the least destructive way to restore alignment? Not who deserves consequences, not how do I protect myself, just alignment. I considered my options. I could confront Ethan directly, show him what I'd found, give him a chance to self-correct. That path had merit, but also risk. Once someone realizes they're exposed, their behavior changes, documentation disappears, narratives shift. I could escalate informally, ask questions upward, hint at concerns. That path often results in being labeled unclear or overly cautious. It diffuses responsibility without resolving it. Or I could do what the system actually required. I could submit the documentation through the proper channel, clean, factual, complete, without commentary. No accusations, no framing, just truth, presented where truth was designed to go. That option felt cold at first, procedural, but the more I examined it, the more it aligned with my values. Accountability without spectacle, integrity without aggression. I wasn't interested in being right. I was interested in being accurate. I spent the rest of that evening preparing the file, not adding anything new, just organizing what already existed. I double-checked citations, ensured timelines were clear, removed any language that could be interpreted as opinion. When I finally closed the folder, it felt finished. Not satisfying, not triumphant. Finished. I didn't celebrate. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't even feel relief. What I felt was resolve. Because once you see something clearly, choosing not to act becomes a decision in itself. And I knew, without drama, without anger, that I couldn't unsee what I had seen. Whatever happened next would happen because the facts were allowed to stand on their own. And for the first time in a long while, I trusted that to be enough. There's a moment, quiet, almost mundane, when indecision ends. It doesn't feel like courage, it feels like alignment. Like realizing that one option allows you to sleep, and the others slowly erode something you won't get back. That was the moment I was standing in. I didn't rush it. The file sat untouched for 3 days. Not because I was hesitating, but because I needed to be certain that my motivation was clean. I went to work. I attended meetings. I watched Ethan operate as usual. Confident, assured, increasingly removed from the details he once reviewed closely. Nothing new happened, and that in itself was telling. The pattern would continue unless something interrupted it. Not emotionally, structurally. I revisited my options one last time, this time without sentiment. If I did nothing, the misrepresentations would compound, not dramatically but quietly, until one day they wouldn't be defensible anymore. And the fallout would be broader than any one person. If I spoke to Ethan directly, I would be giving him information he was not prepared to receive neutrally. Even well-intentioned people protect themselves when confronted with evidence. That conversation would not be about correction. It would be about containment. And if I escalated improperly, emotionally, vaguely, without documentation, I would become the variable. The story would shift from what happened to how I handled it. That was not acceptable to me. The irreversible option was also the cleanest one. Submitting the report through formal compliance channels meant relinquishing control over the outcome. I wouldn't get to narrate it, I wouldn't get to soften it, I wouldn't get to protect anyone from consequences, including myself. But it also meant the facts would be evaluated on their own terms. That mattered. I wasn't choosing escalation, I was choosing. The decision crystallized on a Tuesday morning. I remember because the office was unusually quiet. No meetings until late afternoon. The kind of space where choices echo more clearly. I opened the folder one last time. I reviewed it not as its creator, but as an outsider. I asked myself, if I received this, would I understand it? Would I trust it? Would I see intent or just information? The answer was yes, so I submitted it. No cover letter, no commentary, just the documentation, routed exactly as policy dictated. When I clicked send, nothing dramatic happened. No surge of adrenaline, no sense of finality, just a subtle release of tension I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. The rest of the day passed normally. Emails, tasks, a brief check-in with Ethan, where he asked about timelines. I answered calmly, accurately. He had no idea, and that was important. Because this wasn't about catching someone off guard. It was about allowing the system to respond as designed. I didn't monitor the process obsessively, I didn't follow up, I didn't warn anyone. Once the truth was in motion, my role was complete. That night, I thought about how often people believe decisions like this are fueled by anger or ego. How rarely they understand that the real motivator is usually exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying misalignment quietly for too long. I wasn't angry with Ethan. I was done compensating for choices that weren't mine. The decision point wasn't about him at all. It was about me deciding that my integrity wasn't a private virtue. It was something that deserved structural support, that deserved to exist beyond my own restraint. From that moment on, whatever unfolded would unfold without my intervention. I had chosen the irreversible path, not because it was harsh, but because it was honest. Once the documentation was submitted, my job changed in a very specific way. I stopped doing anything about it. That's the part most people misunderstand. They imagine follow-ups, secret meetings, anxious waiting. They imagine someone hovering over outcomes, trying to steer them. I did none of that. I moved in silence by returning fully to my role, precisely as it was defined. I answered questions when asked. I completed assignments as usual. I didn't hint, I didn't allude. I didn't prepare anyone for what might be coming. And because nothing about my behavior shifted outwardly, nothing triggered suspicion, the process unfolded on a different plane, one I wasn't meant to access or influence. That separation was intentional. Compliance only works when it's insulated from narrative pressure. What I did notice slowly was friction. Small requests began coming in from departments I rarely interacted with. Requests for historical files, clarifications on timelines, access to original versions of reports. They were polite, neutral, procedural. I provided everything promptly. I didn't add context unless asked. I didn't interpret. I didn't editorialize. Each response was clean, factual, time-stamped. Whoo! Ethan, meanwhile, continued as usual. If anything, he became more relaxed. The quarter was closing cleanly on the surface. Leadership seemed satisfied. No one was asking uncomfortable questions. At least not in the rooms he occupied. That false calm is common. When systems start to strain, the pressure often shows up far from where it's being applied. A few meetings were rescheduled. A couple of standing reviews were postponed without explanation. No one announced anything, but the cadence shifted. Cadence. People felt it without naming it. I felt it too, but differently. I wasn't anxious. I wasn't anticipating vindication. I was observing cause and effect. One afternoon, I was asked to walk through a reconciliation process with someone from internal review. The conversation was technical, almost boring. They asked how classifications were typically handled, what documentation standards were expected, whether exceptions were common. I answered honestly, not defensively, not strategically, just honestly. They thanked me and ended the call. That was it. The silence afterward wasn't empty. It was active. Things were moving, just not where anyone could see them. At no point did I feel tempted to intervene or accelerate. In fact, restraint became easier the longer I practiced it. I trusted the material. I trusted the process. What I didn't trust anymore was improvisation. I saw how often organizations rely on people smoothing over gaps instead of addressing them. How much invisible labor goes into maintaining the appearance of stability? By stepping back, I wasn't creating instability. I was allowing existing instability to surface. There's a difference. I also noticed something else, something personal. Without the burden of protecting outcomes, I had more mental space. I slept better. I stopped replaying conversations. I felt grounded in a way I hadn't in years. That surprised me. I had assumed that acting would create stress. Instead, it removed a quiet, constant pressure I'd normalized. I wasn't bracing anymore. Weeks passed. Then one morning, Ethan canceled a one-on-one with me. No explanation, no reschedule. Later that day, he asked for a specific data set, one he hadn't requested in months. I sent it, unchanged. He replied with a single word, "Thanks." His tone hadn't shifted, but his questions had. They were narrower now, more cautious, less assumptive. Something had reached him, if not in detail, then in effect. Still, I said nothing. Moving in silence doesn't mean disappearing. It means refusing to contaminate a process with emotion or narrative. And as the system continued to work without interference, I understood something clearly. This was no longer about what I did. It was about what I had stopped doing. I had stopped absorbing risk that wasn't mine, stopped correcting others' blind spots without acknowledgement, stopped protecting structures that didn't protect the truth. Whatever consequences emerged would do so on their own timeline. All I had to do was remain steady, and I was very good at that. The consequences didn't arrive with an announcement. They arrived in confusion. At first, it showed up in small, almost forgettable ways. A meeting agenda that suddenly included financial alignment review. A senior leader is joining a call they usually skipped. Questions that circled the same topic twice, asked by different people, from slightly different angles. No one said the word investigation. They didn't have to. Ethan noticed the shift before anyone else did. I could tell by the way he started checking details that he used to wave through. He asked for backup more often. He forwarded emails with short questions instead of assumptions. The confidence was still there, but it had narrowed, like a hallway where the walls have moved closer together. People around us felt it too, though they couldn't name it. Conversations slowed. Decisions that once took minutes stretched into days. A few projects were paused pending clarification. That phrase appeared everywhere, vague enough to mean nothing and everything. Still, no one looked at me. That was the quietest consequence of all. I continued working exactly as before. I didn't insert myself into conversations that weren't mine. I didn't volunteer explanations unless asked. When I was asked, I answered fully, no more, no less. The pressure was moving upward now, and it changed the atmosphere. Leadership began asking for reconciliations that hadn't been requested in years, historical comparisons, variance explanations that required revisiting old assumptions. Each request peeled back another layer of narrative. I watched people struggle with that, not because the data was damning, but because it didn't align with the story they'd been telling themselves. About growth, about stability, about control. Ethan started spending more time behind closed doors. His calendar was filled with meetings that weren't shared. When he spoke in group settings, his language became more cautious, less declarative. He stopped summarizing my work for me. That change didn't feel like vindication. It felt like inevitability. One afternoon, a colleague leaned over and asked quietly, "Do you know what's going on?" I said no. That wasn't a lie. I didn't know what stage the process was in. I didn't know who had seen what. I only knew that the system was responding exactly as designed when enough friction accumulates. The hardest part was resisting the urge to explain, not out of secrecy, but out of respect for process. Once you start narrating consequences, you risk turning facts into factions. I didn't want sides. I wanted resolution. The first clear signal came when a scheduled quarterly review was postponed indefinitely. No reason given, just a brief note from leadership. That never happened. Ethan didn't comment on it, but he stopped delegating financial summaries to me. Instead, he asked me to prepare raw data packets uninterpreted. That was new. He was being careful, not because he suspected me, because the ground beneath him was no longer stable. What struck me most during this phase was how many people sensed loss before they understood the cause. They felt delays, uncertainty, tension, but they didn't yet know what was unraveling or why. That's how systems fail, not all at once, but in perception first. I didn't feel satisfaction watching this unfold. I felt a strange compassion. Ethan had built his authority on smooth delivery, on being the person who could present certainty upward. When that certainty was questioned, everything else had to adjust. He wasn't being attacked. He was being examined. An examination feels like punishment when you're not used to it. Through it all, I remained where I had always been, steady, precise, unreactive. The same person they'd underestimated, the same one they'd trusted with details. They still trusted me. And that trust, unaltered by emotion or suspicion, allowed the process to continue cleanly. The consequences had begun, not with collapse, but with gravity. And once gravity asserts itself, nothing has to be forced. By the time anyone tried to fix it, the window had already closed. That's the thing about systems built on quiet corrections and unspoken accommodations. Once scrutiny arrives, there's no clean way to rewind. You can't undo months of narrative with a single clarification. You can't reframe what's already been traced. I could feel when that realization reached Ethan. It wasn't dramatic. There was no outburst, no visible panic. It showed up in the smallest behaviors, the kind people don't realize reveal the most. He started asking questions he should have asked a year earlier, not accusatory ones, careful ones. about documentation standards, about why certain classifications had been handled verbally, about whether alternative treatments would have materially changed outcomes. The questions weren't wrong. They were just late. I answered each one patiently. I pulled files, I referenced dates, I explained processes as they had existed at the time. I didn't speculate about intent or consequence. At one point, he said, almost to himself, "We should have formalized this earlier." I nodded. That was the closest thing to agreement we shared. What he didn't say, but clearly understood, was that formalizing it now wouldn't help. Documentation created after scrutiny begins doesn't restore trust. It confirms its absence. Meetings with leadership grew longer and less conclusive. Follow-ups multiplied. Language shifted from aligning to addressing concerns, from minor variances to material review. Words matter when they change. Ethan tried to regain footing by tightening control. He requested more frequent updates, more drafts, more internal reviews. But those actions only highlighted how much interpretation had previously been unexamined. Every attempt to stabilize introduced more questions. That's when the panic set in, not overtly but structurally. Decisions stalled, timelines slipped, people hesitated to approve things without double-checking. The system slowed itself down in self-defense. And slowing down exposed everything that had been rushed. One afternoon, Ethan called me into his office. The door closed, the blinds stayed open. He didn't accuse me of anything. He didn't even ask a direct question. He said, "If there's anything you think I should know, now would be the time." It was an invitation, a late one. I considered my response carefully. Not because I was afraid, but because precision mattered. I said, "Everything I know is already documented." That was all. I didn't say it coldly. I didn't say it triumphantly. I said it plainly. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture did. A subtle shift, like someone realizing the map they'd been using was outdated. After that conversation, I wasn't included in certain meetings anymore. Not intentionally, I think, just by default. Leadership was engaging directly with compliance, with audit, with legal. That's how you know it's too late. Once conversations move into formal channels, personal narratives stop carrying weight. The irony is that if Ethan had slowed down earlier, if he'd been willing to complicate the story when it mattered, none of this would have escalated. The adjustments could have been corrected quietly, transparently. But systems don't reward early discomfort. They reward speed. Until they don't. In the final weeks, the office felt heavy. People spoke in lowered tones. Calendars were guarded. Everyone sensed an outcome approaching, even if they didn't know its shape. I didn't feel relief. I felt distance, not emotional distance, structural distance, the kind that comes when you've done what you can, and the rest no longer belongs to you. I was called into one last meeting with internal review. They thanked me for my thoroughness, asked a few final clarifying questions, closed their notebooks. There was nothing left to add. When the system finally moved to a conclusion, it didn't do so loudly. It did so decisively. And by then, there was nothing left to fix, only consequences to assign. The confrontation, when it finally came, didn't feel like one. There was no raised voice, no accusation, no emotional release waiting on the other side of the door. It was a meeting scheduled with the same neutral calendar invite language used for budget reviews and process updates. That, more than anything, told me how final it was. I was asked to join a brief meeting with leadership and compliance present. Ethan arrived last. He looked composed, tired, but careful. The kind of care that comes when you've accepted that outcomes are no longer negotiable. The room was quiet. Someone from compliance summarized the findings. Not dramatically, not with judgment, just facts. Dates, documentation gaps. Reclassifications that had improved short-term appearance without sufficient disclosure. They didn't say a fake financial report. They didn't need to. The phrase existed implicitly in the alignment between the original data and what had been presented upward. The gap spoke for itself. Ethan listened without interruption. When asked to respond, he did so calmly. He acknowledged pressure, timelines, the desire to present stability. He didn't deny the adjustments. He explained them. That distinction mattered. Explanations are not defenses when the issue is accuracy. No one argued with him. No one attacked his character. The conversation stayed exactly where it belonged, on process and responsibility. When they asked me a question, it was a simple one. Whether the documentation accurately reflected my understanding at the time. I said yes. That was all. I didn't add commentary. I didn't recount past conversations. I didn't describe how often concerns had been softened or deferred. None of that was necessary. The truth had already done its work. There was a pause after that, a quiet one, the kind that isn't uncomfortable, just conclusive. Leadership thanked us both, said they would follow up separately. The meeting ended. That was it. Later that afternoon, I saw Ethan clearing out his office. No audience, no spectacle. Security was present, not aggressively, just procedurally. He nodded at me when our eyes met. I nodded back. There was no satisfaction in that moment, just closure. He wasn't escorted out because of me. He was escorted out because systems eventually correct for what's been deferred too long. The promotion came days later. It wasn't framed as a reward. It was framed as continuity. Leadership needed someone who understood the data deeply, who had demonstrated consistency, and who could be trusted to maintain alignment between reporting and reality. They didn't mention the investigation. They didn't have to. When I accepted the role, I did so without celebration. No announcement, no internal post, just a quiet shift in responsibility. What struck me most was how little I felt the need to explain. People adjusted quickly. The same ones who had once seen me as background noise now asked for my perspective early. Not because I demanded it, but because the structure now required it. Authority, I learned, doesn't always arrive with acknowledgement. Sometimes it arrives with silence and stays. The confrontation had no heat because it didn't need any. No one was punished emotionally. No one was humiliated. The outcome was firm, clean, and grounded in facts that had been waiting patiently to be seen. And in that restraint, there was a kind of justice I hadn't known how to name before. After everything settled, I expected to feel different. I thought there might be a sense of arrival, some internal marker that said this is who you are now. But identity doesn't change that way. It shifts quietly, through behavior, not titles. What changed first was my posture in rooms, not physically, though maybe that too, but internally. I no longer waited to be invited into conversations that directly involved my work. I spoke when accuracy required it, not when permission was implied. And because I did it calmly, without defensiveness, people listened. Not out of deference, out of necessity. I also learned how to let silence work without disappearing into it. When a question hung in the air, I didn't rush to fill it. When decisions were being shaped, I didn't assume my role was to support them. I assumed my role was to inform them. That distinction matters. I didn't become louder. I didn't become sharper. I became clearer. And clarity, I've learned, carries its own authority. The promotion didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel aligned. The scope of my responsibility finally matched the scope of my awareness. I was no longer absorbing risk informally or correcting narratives quietly. If something was uncertain, it stayed uncertain until it was resolved. If a number needed explanation, it received one, documented, shared, and traceable. That shift wasn't always comfortable for others, but it was stable. I was careful not to swing to the opposite extreme. I didn't overcorrect by asserting control or policing others' work. I remembered how easy it is to mistake visibility for dominance. Quiet dominance, I've learned, is about steadiness. It's about being the person whose presence reduces chaos, not creates it, whose words slow conversations just enough to bring them back to reality. I also had to reconcile something internally. For a long time, I believed that being underestimated was a kind of shield. That kept expectations manageable, that allowed me to observe without pressure. There's truth in that. But there's also a cost. Staying small for too long doesn't preserve you. It erodes you. Not dramatically, but incrementally. I don't regret the years I spent learning restraint. They taught me patience, precision, and the value of timing. But I no longer confuse restraint with invisibility. One is a choice. The other is an absence. Who I am now is not someone who won. I'm someone who understands systems, how they bend, how they break, and how they can be corrected without spectacle. I don't seek confrontation. I don't fear it either. I don't assume good faith will always protect truth, but I don't abandon good faith as a principle. What I know now is this: integrity doesn't require you to be loud, but it does require you to be complete, to follow through, to allow facts to exist where they're meant to exist. I still carry the same notebook. I still document carefully. I still listen more than I speak. But when I speak now, it's because the moment requires it, not because I'm filling a role someone else assigned me. And that difference, quiet as it may seem, has changed everything. When people hear a story like this, they often look for a lesson that feels dramatic, a warning, a victory, a moment where everything turns on courage or cleverness. That isn't what stayed with me. What stayed with me is how quiet the entire process was, how little it resembled the stories we're usually told about power, justice, or standing up for yourself. There was no revenge here, no moment of satisfaction that made the years of invisibility suddenly feel worth it. Ethan losing his role didn't restore anything for me emotionally. It didn't validate old frustrations or erase the cost of staying quiet for too long. What it did was restore alignment between numbers and narratives, between responsibility and authority, between who was doing the work and who was accountable for it. And that matters more than winning. The phrase people keep returning to when they hear this story is fake financial report. It sounds dramatic. It sounds intentional, but the truth is more uncomfortable than that. Most damage isn't caused by people trying to deceive. It's caused by people slowly convincing themselves that accuracy can wait, that clarity can be deferred, that small misrepresentations are harmless if the outcome feels stable. They aren't. Not because they're evil, but because they compound, and someone always ends up carrying that weight quietly until they decide not to anymore. The hardest part of this journey wasn't submitting the documentation. It wasn't sitting in the room when the findings were presented. It wasn't even watching my boss be escorted out. The hardest part was accepting that being patient, capable, and reasonable does not automatically protect you, or the truth. Systems don't correct themselves out of fairness. They correct themselves when facts are allowed to exist without being softened, filtered, or managed for comfort. If there's a moral here, it's not speak up sooner or trust no one. Those are easy conclusions, incomplete ones. The real lesson for me was this. You are not obligated to absorb risk just because you are capable of doing so quietly. You are not disloyal for insisting on accuracy. And silence is only virtuous when it's chosen, not when it's assigned. Quiet dominance isn't about control. It's about restraint paired with readiness, about knowing when to wait and when waiting becomes complicity. I didn't burn bridges. I didn't humiliate anyone. I didn't announce myself. I let the truth stand long enough to speak for itself. And when it didn't shout. It simply restructured the room. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of your own experience, being trusted but not seen, relied on but not included, I want to leave you with one question, not a directive, not advice, just a question worth sitting with. Where in your life are you staying quiet out of professionalism, when what's really being asked of you is erasure? I'd genuinely like to know your thoughts.
Cảm ơn các bạn vì đã theo dõi đến cuối. Đừng quên ấn like, share và bật chuông để không bỏ lỡ những video mới nhất nhé. Hẹn gặp lại.